Pokemon just revealed all 81 cards from the upcoming expansion Abyss Eye, which is our pitch black equivalent set. And honestly, this set might completely change the competitive scene. So today, we're breaking down everything you need to know from the full Abyss Eye reveal. So without further ado, let's dive in. So here's all the cards that are coming around in Abyss Eye. Now we know for a fact that in Abyss Eye they're getting 4 Mega Pokemon, while we're probably getting 5, because Mega Slowbro has already been released in Japan, but it's not in our English equivalent set Chaos Rising. So we might expect a Mega Slowbro coming around in our pitch black equivalent set. But other than that, this set has a lot of competitive value, and I'm all here for it. Sadly, there was no more support for Ghost Veil Pokemon. Think about more Pokemon with the Ghost Veil ability, so we're just stuck with 16 Ghost Veilers at the moment. But we did in fact get more support for Wailord, but more on that later. But as things stand, we will get all of the cards that are coming around in Abyss Eye in our pitch black equivalent set July 17th, and expect some more pre-release events 2 weeks prior to that. So let's talk about some new reveals. Starting off, we have Lurantis. Lurantis is a stage 1 Pokemon with 260 HP, and it has 2 attacks. The first one, being Lively Cutter, does 60 damage, but does 200 more damage if this Pokemon was healed during this turn. Now we know for a fact there is a Primarina in this set which has some healing potential. We still have Super Potion in the format which can heal off this damage, but 260 hit points is easily to get through because there's still Brave Bangle in the format and there's still Max Belt, not to mention Mega Lucario just hits straight through this because it has access to Premium Power Pro. And then its second attack, Leaf Guard, does 140 damage, but during your opponent's next turn, that Pokemon takes 50 less damage, which makes this Pokemon more tanky, but I don't think this has any competitive value. Moving on, we have my favorite archetype. I am super excited for this one to come out. Sadly, we do not get more Ghost Veil support, but we make do with what we have. This Sinistcha is rather amazing because its Matchup Brute attack does 4 damage counters to each of your opponent's Pokemon, and that can ramp up rather fast, because if you can manage to attack twice with the Sinistcha and then finish off with the Spiritomb stays they can quadruple the amount of damage counters that have already been placed on your opponent's Pokemon. So if you're looking for more reasons to play Funnel, here it is. Sadly, there's no more Picnic Basket in the format, so you have to make do with the Funnel. And next up, I think this is a very interesting Pokemon, and it can become its own archetype as well, because Heatran has 2 attacks. The first one, being Singe, states your opponent's active Pokemon is now burnt, which is not really what we want to do. There's other means to do that, but it's all about this second attack. Its second attack, Lava Wall, does 120 damage, but then Heatran does not take any damage from the opponent's Pokemon that is burnt. And here's the tricky part, right? There is still Volcanion EX in the format that came around in Journey Together, where that Pokemon is active. You may make your opponent's active Pokemon burnt, then you can switch back into this Heatran, attack with Lava Wall, and there is also the Magmortar that came around in Journey Together, which takes for more damage if your opponent's Pokemon is burnt. So this will be your burn box archetype, and I'm very excited to build around that one as well. And then we have Sizzlipede. Now, Sizzlipede is rather interesting. It has 2 attacks. The first one, being Controlled Burn, discards the top card of your opponent's deck. That is all fine, but it's all about this second attack, because for 3 colorless energy, Bug Panic states it does 50 times the damage, and for each Pokemon you find there that has the Bug Panic attack, it does 50 damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. You shuffle those Pokemon back into your deck, but all the other cards that aren't Pokemon, you have to discard those. So this is going to be a self-mill, but heavy-hitting deck. Now, 3 colorless energy, you can't simply achieve that with Ignition Energy because this is a basic Pokemon, but we might see more Pokemon coming around with the Bug Panic attack, so I'm all here for it. And then we come to Wailord EX. Now, I've already talked about this Wailord EX in another video, but for those of you who didn't, Wailord EX is a massive stage 1 Pokemon with 380 HP, which is just massive. And it also has 2 attacks. For 3 water energy, which is Surf, does 120 damage. That doesn't sound like a whole lot, but it's all about this second attack being Fall Down. So for 5 water energy, Fall Down does 270 damage, but then this Pokemon is now asleep. That is all fine, because when this Pokemon gets released, we will have access to the Bubble Energy that came around in Chaos Rising. Bubble Energy states that this Pokemon cannot be affected by status conditions or effects. So after using a successful Fall Down, this Pokemon is not asleep, and you consecutively do 270 damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. But then, in this same set, we will get the best partner for this Wailord EX archetype deck. But more on that later. Next up, we have this Seeking. And now this Seeking is rather interesting, because this can be combined as well with that Misty Supporter card. But more on that later. So this Seeking has the Hydro Jet attack, which states this Pokemon does 30 times the damage for each water energy attached to this Pokemon to one of your opponent's Pokemon. So imagine this Pokemon has 3 water energy attached to it, so 3 times 30 does 90 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, but I did mention with that Wailord, we have Dugong in the format which came around in perfect order, so you can switch all of those water energies from one of your bench Pokemon to your active Pokemon. So this Seeking can be your finisher, a snipe Pokemon in this archetype. Although it is possible to lose all of your water energy if that Pokemon gets knocked out, so use it wisely. But imagine this Pokemon getting 10 energies attached to it. That is 300 snipe damage you can do onto one of your opponent's Pokemon. But like I said, this is going to be your finisher, and you don't want to do this mid-game. And it's important to note that it states it needs to be water energy attached to this Pokemon, so you cannot use ignition energy because that states it all counts for 3 colorless energy. And remember when I talked about the perfect partner for Wailord EX? Well, here it is. It is the Primarina. So with its ability Max Melody, when you play this Pokemon to evolve one of your Pokemon in play, you may heal all the damage done to one of your Pokemon. So if your Wailord gets a hit and you want to heal off all that damage and you don't have access to Jumbo Ice Cream, you evolve into Primarina and heal off all that damage done to your big whale. So imagine this deck playing Hero's Cape, suddenly your Wailord gets 480 HP, it gets hit twice, your opponent's already frustrated, and then you evolve into this Primarina, healing off all that damage. That sounds like a fun archetype, right? And next up, we have Manectric. Now, this Manectric is very interesting. It also has 2 attacks, the first one being Flash Barrier. It only does 50 damage, but during your opponent's next turn, this Pokemon cannot be damaged from evolution Pokemon. Now here's where things get interesting. There's not a lot of archetypes anymore that hit with big basic Pokemon. Think about Raging Bolt. That one is still in the format. There is still Absol, Kangaskhan, but other than that, there's not many basic Pokemon that can hit through this Pokemon. Most of the existing archetypes we have are evolution Pokemon. So if you want to build a very big counter box, you might want to put this Pokemon in it. And then its second attack, Sonic Edge, is just Shred for 110 damage. So this Pokemon can act like a wall, which also shreds your opponent. That is really interesting. So you can expect this Pokemon to end up in a very annoying archetype. Think about Control or another type of walls. Yeah, it's coming back. And then we have the new big boy, Mega Zeraora EX. I am very excited about this Pokemon because it also comes with its legacy move being Thunder Fists. It has 60 times the damage for each lightning energy attached to this Pokemon. Sadly, we just lost Electric Generator, which accelerated lightning energy from our deck, but the next best partner we have is Electric. Electric can accelerate lightning energies from your discard pile to one of your benched Pokemon, and that is a way to charge up your Mega Zeraora EX to do some very big damage. And then its second attack, Zapdos Turn, does 150 damage, and it's basically a strafe. You can switch this Pokemon with one of your benched Pokemon. Now, this can also be one of those hit and run type playstyle decks, where back in the day, you would switch into a Mimikyu and you would block all the damage done to that Mimikyu, but Mimikyu just left the format. So what is still left to do? We can still play the Sylveon from Prismatic Evolution, because that one blocks all damage done to that Pokemon as well by your opponent's Pokemon EX. But then we have Miraidon, and Miraidon might also be a good partner for your Mega Zeraora EX, because it has the Photon Code ability. which states if this Pokemon is in the active spot and gets knocked out by your opponent's active Pokemon, you may switch all of those lightning energies attached to Miraidon onto one of your benched Pokemon. Now do note, if this Miraidon gets knocked out by Dusknoir, this ability does not kick in, because it's not knocked out by an attack from your opponent. It's knocked out by an ability from your opponent. And then its attack, Thunder, does 90 damage and 30 damage to itself, which is not much, but it's a good one-price attacker in that deck. And then we have the Jinx. Now Jinx is really interesting, because it has the Wicked Kiss attack. It doesn't do damage, but it has a very cool effect, which states, at the end of your opponent's next turn, discard that Pokemon and all attached cards to it. So that can be very annoying if your opponent doesn't play switching options and that Pokemon cannot retreat. That Pokemon gets discarded. Do note, it states discarded. It's not knocked out, get no prize cards from it, but it's removed from play, which is equal as annoying, right? And then we come back to my favorite archetype yet again. It is the Bannet with that Ghost Veil ability. And that Bannet has a very cool attack, being the Dull Catch. So Dull Catch does 80 damage to your opponent's active Pokemon, and then you get to cherry pick your deck for any cards and put it into your hand, which is basically like a Shinobi Blade from Greninja EX, but then in a single prize Pokemon, but only for 80 damage, which isn't a whole lot, but it sets you up for next turn, which can be big if you want to pull off some combo turns. Think about Team Rocket's Transceiver for a Team Rocket's Petrol equal a Brilliant Blender, discarding all those Pokemon that have the Ghost Veil ability, and then line up a very big Spiritomb attack. Next up, we have Mega Chandelure EX. Now this is a very interesting Pokemon, because through its ability Cursed Flame, it increases your opponent's active retreat cost by 1 colorless, and that synchronizes very well with its attack Phantom Maze, because Phantom Maze for 2 Psychic Energy does 130 base damage, but it's increased by 50 more damage for each retreat cost in your opponent's active Pokemon. And here's where things get interesting, right? Because there is still Gravity Gemstone in the format. So with your Mega Chandelure and a Gravity Gemstone attached to it, your opponent's active Pokemon's retreat cost is 2 more, which instantly boosts this attack by 100 damage. That is, if your opponent's active Pokemon has 0 retreat cost, of course. But yes, I hear you, there is still Latias EX in the format, which reduces your basic Pokemon's retreat cost to 0. But of course, this Mega Chandelure EX will only target down those Pokemon with heavy retreat costs. But that all synchronizes well with this Marshadow, because Marshadow has the Shadow Knot attack, so it does 30 times the damage for each colorless retreat cost in your opponent's active Pokemon. But that can also be boosted with Gravity Gemstone, like I mentioned. So this is going to be your one prize Mega Chandelure, kind of. It doesn't have the same amount of damage output, but it's a good one prize attacker to boost that deck as well. And then we have Annihilape. Now, I love myself some Annihilape, especially this one, because it has a sturdy ability, which states if this Pokemon would get knocked out by an attack from your opponent's Pokemon, if heads, this Pokemon is not knocked out and its remaining HP becomes 10. And then it has an attack, Ghost Blow. It does 100 base damage, but then you can place 5 damage counters on one of your opponent's benched Pokemon, which is kind of like Dragapult at home, but then for a 1-prize Pokemon. And then we move over to Rampardos. Now we already know this set makes it possible for fossil-type Pokemon to actually function, and this is going to be a very fun archetype. So this Pokemon has a very cool ability, Destructive Headbutt. If this Pokemon is in the active spot, you may flip a coin, and if heads, then you may discard an energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. And if that wasn't annoying enough, we already get in the supported cards, which boost this even more. But more on that later. And then its attack, Rampaging Hammer for 2 fighting energy, does 150 damage, but then during your next turn, attacks used by this Pokemon does 150 more damage. So Rampaging Hammer does 300 damage the turn after. So this can ramp up rather easily. And then we have the star of the show, Mega Darkrai EX. Now this Pokemon is what the set is all about. It has 2 very strong attacks. The first one being Night Raid for 2 Dark Energy, does 110 base damage, but if your benched Pokemon have any damage counters on them, it does 110 more damage. Which does seem like Roaring Moon EX, which if you discarded a Stadium card, this attack does 120 more damage. But then it's worded a bit differently. But then it's all about this second attack. So Abyss Eye states, if your opponent's Pokemon is affected by status condition, think about poison, burns, confusion, and that's a big one, then your opponent's active Pokemon is now knocked out. It needs 3 Darkness Energy, but we all know this deck is going to run Toxtricity to be able to easily accelerate those Dark Energies and to also place those damage counters onto one of our benched Pokemon, so it is easier for us to charge up this attack. So it can knock out literally everything in the game, if there's no mist energy attached to it, of course, because that's going to block this effect of this attack. And then next up, we have Morpeko EX. Now, this is a fun one. Its first attack for 1 Darkness Energy, Wheel Draw, states you may shuffle your hand into your deck and draw 6 cards, which is all fine if you have a clunky start and you want to reshuffle your hands into your deck and you get 6 new cards. On the other hand, if this is your attack going second, that's not going to go well for you. But then its second attack, Hunger Bomb, does 40 damage plus 40 more damage for each damage counter on this Pokemon. And here's where things get interesting, right? Because there's still Team Rocket's Venture Bomb in the standard format. We have Toxtricity accelerating energies onto our Pokemon, so these damage counters can ramp up rather easily. Do note that Risky Ruins won't work on this Pokemon because it's a Dark-type Pokemon. Risky Ruins places damage counters on all non-Dark type Pokemon. But imagine 2 Toxtricity accelerating energy onto this Morpeko. That is 40 damage. Imagine 2 Tail Flips from Team Rocket's Venture Bomb. That is also 40 damage. That is already 160 damage on Morpeko times 40. Yeah, this Pokemon deals out a ton of damage. So this will be your Glass Cannon, nuke everything, and get one shot easily in return type Pokemon. But if you were to put a Legacy Energy in this deck, things might want to change around. And then we move over to Bastiodon. Now this is going to be your very big support Pokemon in your fossil box, because it has the Ancient Bulwark ability, which states, while this Pokemon is on your bench, prevent all damage done by your opponent's Pokemon that have 2 or less energies attached to it. And that is interesting, right? Prevents all the damage done to your Pokemon. So no more snipe damage, no more Dragonbolt's Phantom Dive, although the damage counters do go through because that's an effect of an attack. But everything else, it's blocked. And that is fun. So I really can't wait to play around with this fossil box. Although this is a stage 2. We work with a lot of stage 2 in our deck, but that doesn't take away the fact that it's going to be a lot of fun to play with. And then we have Mega Excadrill. Now, Mega Excadrill has the Dig and Break attack, which does 90 damage, and you may discard the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck. So this is going to be a mill-type Pokemon, which is going to be very fun because we missed those in the standard format. But then its second attack, Maximum Drill, does 200 base damage, but if this Pokemon has 2 more energy attached to that Pokemon, it does 130 more damage. So Maximum Drill does 230 damage if this Pokemon has 5 energies attached to it, which is an easy feat with Matang, getting to accelerate all of those energies onto that Pokemon and then use Maximum Drill to knock out almost everything. And then we have Sylvally. Now, this is rather an interesting Pokemon, but it has the Buddy Call ability, which states if you have no cards in your hand, you may search your deck for a supporter card and put it into your hand, which works very well for a specific supporter card also revealed in this Abyss Eye set, but more on that later. And then its attack, slash 130 damage and discard 1 energy from this Pokemon, which is not a lot, but this is obviously going to be a support type Pokemon. And then we move over to the trainer cards. So starting off, we have Dark Bell. So if you play this card, both active Pokemon are now confused, except any dark Pokemon. So that works very well for the previous Pokemon that has been revealed in Phantasmal Flames, being the Mismagius, but it's actually more made for the Mega Darkrai, because if your opponent's active Pokemon has a status condition, it is now knocked out. So that's going to be a perfect partner to knock out everything in the standard format. And then we have the Heroic Bomb Tool cards. Now, this is a very fun one for single price decks, as well as other non-Mega Pokemon decks, because it states if this card is attached to a Pokemon which is not a Mega Pokemon, and it would take damage for your opponent's active Pokemon that is a Mega Pokemon that deals 240 or more damage to your Pokemon, you can place 12 damage counters on your opponent's active Pokemon. So this is going to be a very niche card, but later on, if all of those non-mega Pokemon getting rotated out, think about I-Block or J-Block, we all have mega Pokemon in the format. So then this card might be viable to use. And then we have Retry Badge. Now, here's a fun one. You can attach this to Mega Kangaskhan, and the effect of this tool card states, so after you flip any coins for this colorless Pokemon this card is attached to, you may ignore the results of those coin flips and just reflip again. So instantly, Mega Kangaskhan comes to mind. If you're not happy with the instant tails you flip, you may flip again. So that's a 50-50 chance of hitting more damage with your Mega Kangaskhan. Now, obviously, Terrabox comes to mind, where you play Glass Trumpet to accelerate energies onto your Mega Kangaskhan and make that your main attacker with this new tool card. But obviously, there is still Mega Lucario and Garchomp in the format, and those going to ruin your fun for the day. Next up, we have Misty's Energy. Now, I already talked about this card. This is a very explosive energy acceleration card, being a one-on-one copy of Kiawe. So you get to search your deck for 4 water-type energies and attach them to one of your Pokemon. But if you use this supporter card, your turn ends, which is a very good trade-off because you get to accelerate a ton of energy from your deck. But then you make that Pokemon a very big target. So do bear that in mind. Now, remember when I talked about the Sylvally? Well, this supporter card is going to be your best body catch. So you may only play this card when it's the last card in your hand, and during this turn, attacks used by your non-rule box Pokemon do 80 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. So this can be put in Okidogi, this can be put in Festival Lead, this can be put in all other non-rule box type decks. So imagine the possibilities. Although the downside to it needs to be the last card you play from your hands, which is not ideal and very hard to pull off if you have a large hand to work with. Now imagine Crushing Hammer in a supporter card. That is basically what this Rust Syndicate Grunt is. But you can only play this card if one of your Pokemon was knocked out during your opponent's last turn, and then you get to discard an energy card from your opponent's Pokemon. So if you already play 4 Crushing Hammers, well, now you get 8. If you play 4 of these supporter cards, of course. And then we have Gwyn. Now, I already talked about this card in another video of the Ghost Failures, but basically, this is a very good draw supporting card. If you discard 2 Pokemon from your hand, you may draw 3 cards for each Pokemon you discarded in this way. This is basically discard 2 Pokemon, draw 6 cards. That is insane. If you're playing a non-rule box deck, this is going to be your best draw supporter, because we all know non-rule box decks have terrible draw support. Now, the only stadium in this set is going to be a very huge one, because Fossil Excavation Site is basically a Brock Scouting for fossil type decks. That is amazing. This stadium is what makes these fossil decks actually work, because you can search your deck for 2 cards that have Antique in their name and just put them onto your bench, which basically just works through Baju's Itchy Pollen, because otherwise those Antique cards are item cards and they have to be put down as item cards. So they cannot just simply be benched like basic Pokemon. They have to be benched like item cards. And then second to last, we have Bolty Energy. Now, we already knew this one was coming as well. As long as this card isn't attached to a Pokemon, it provides a lightning type energy. But the attacks used by your lightning Pokemon this card is attached to does 20 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. So suddenly, Mega Zeraora EX does a ton more damage. Imagine running 4 copies of this card. Well, Mega Zeraora is going to have some Thunder Fists. And then we finish off with Shadowy Energy. Now, this Shadowy Energy is basically a Shaman at home. When you attach this card to one of your bench Dark Pokemon, you may prevent all that damage done to that bench Dark Pokemon this card is attached to. And that is going to be very big, because in those Dark boxes, you don't typically run a Grass-type Pokemon like the Shaman to protect your bench. So this is going to be your next best option to attach for turn to protect those bench Pokemon from being sniped, like Greninja EX, for example. And that wraps up today's video. If you enjoyed today's video, please make sure to like and subscribe, as well as letting me know down in the comments what you think of this complete Abyss Eye set reveal. And if you want to stick around for a little bit longer, I've got more deck profiles, gameplay videos, and learn to play all on this channel. And with that being said, I'll catch you in the next one.